Thank you so much, everyone who has joined us for hopping on. Today, we have a very special guest telling us a little bit about academic advocacy, how to make change within your institution, as opposed to what we typically focus on here at NSPN, which is more national advocacy. So I'll let him take it away. And thank you again, Azmi, for being on to take care of this and do this for us. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. My pleasure. And thank you for inviting me. And thank you to everyone that showed up and the National Science Policy Network as well. I'm glad to be here today to talk about, academic advocacy and how you can take some steps so that you implement these advocacy and policy changes. And hopefully I'll touch on a little bit of the difference between academic on an institutional versus national, because I know, even on national scale, there's still academic advocacy. So I just wanted to start off with, a little, disclaimer / about myself. So I am a postdoc council member at National Postdoctoral Association. I also work with the Yale Black Postdoctoral Association and the Yale Postdoctoral Association. And I've been involved with movement building schools with other organizations as well. And I was coordinator, I think, with advocacy back when we first booked this. Now I'm just a member, but I'm still involved with them. But this is all to say that, I volunteer at a lot of organizations, but the views that I'm presenting here and interpretations are solely my own. I'm not speaking on behalf of any of these great organizations. So with that, I kind of wanted to start off with just a quick icebreaker for everyone and just kind of maybe give me like 1 or 2 words that, what you feel would describe what an ideal advocacy position would accomplish. So if you were to, take role and work at your, whatever your ideal position you think of, what would you hope that would accomplish? And feel free to type it in the chat or just go off mute and just kind of share so that we can set the stage of, where people's thoughts are on this and how we can maybe incorporate that into the workshop as well. Building relationships with policymakers. That's definitely a good one. That's definitely on a national scale as well. Any other thoughts? And it can be general stuff. So typically people would think of, if you're doing advocacy, it would lead to something like equity or representation is a big one. Also finding solutions to complex problems. Okay. Engaging, restructuring our voting election system. So the accomplishment here would be to restructure it. Serving as a resource when policymakers have science questions. That's great. I just want to write some of them down so that we can go back to all of this. Resource, restructuring. Those are typically all great things that would be accomplished with advocacy. A voice for those who may be in situations of power imbalance. Absolutely. So that's another really great one. And that is exactly what advocacy would hope to accomplish. Impact. Helping other scientists get into policy. I like that one too. So that basically you're trying to build these coalitions, right? So that you can influence as much change as possible. These are all great. So you're all right on the right track. I think you're exactly where the crowd I was hoping for. So we'll hopefully through this workshop today, we'll try to think about, what steps you can take in order to achieve these kind of results for your advocacy efforts. So just a quick overview of the content. We just finished this one, so check. I'm going to start out by talking a little bit about some advocacy concepts in general and some terminologies that are important in academic advocacy. And then we'll jump into some of the main topics for how do you identify a problem that you want to help for, creating that impact or helping others. Advocacy strategies that I've found have kind of summarized or can be applicable for different cases. And then we'll go do some breakout rooms on how do you develop a pitch for the problem that I identified, and then how do you practice some negotiation tactics for when you do want to ask for, what you need to have made. And I'll show some case studies as well of personal advocacy efforts that I've been involved with. And then at the end, I'll just give some take-home messages and see if there's anyone has any questions. But in the meantime, also feel free to ask questions if something is, unclear. Okay, so I wanted to just discuss in general what terminologies are typically used in advocacy and in science. So start just kind of broad, science is the process of information that is gathered in a rational, systemic, testable, reproducible manner versus the concept of what normative science is, which is the science that is developed and presented and may be interpreted usually under a preference. So if you have like a preference for a particular policy or a class of policies, and you can think of that in terms of the difference between when you're presenting data that is something without having any influence on it versus what you believe should be something. And this kind of concept comes up in science that is the difference between, let's say, like medical hard science and then, like ecological science or economics and stuff like that, where there is a preference for a specific type of policy or a specific type of change versus in other sciences, and my background, like in biomedical sciences, it's really more just here's the facts and here's what is happening. So that's kind of important to think about and differentiate when you are advocating in education and in academia. And then also I wanted to talk about the different types of advocacy. So some of the most common ones is, the difference between advocating for yourself versus if you're advocating for another individual or organizational advocacy. So when you're acting on behalf of others. And those will have to have different kind of strategies for them, because if you're, advocating on behalf of others, you need to make sure that they're involved and how you kind of approach that. And then I wanted to briefly mention the concept of coalitions, which is having people from a variety of positions that can share a particular belief system and how they can work together. So we'll kind of bring those words in later, and I wanted to make sure that everyone's kind of clear on it. As far as academic advocacy, I think, there's two definitions that I want to make sure everyone is kind of on the same page with this. So an educational advocate is someone that has good knowledge of the resources that are available, and they're usually like employees of an organization. So typically think like an OMBUDS office, HR person, something like that, where you can approach them and they'll tell you about what is existing. Versus an advocacy and education is someone that identify the needs, and then you can take proactive measures to provide support for people. And that's really the kind of advocacy that we'll be kind of talking about, is the advocacy in education versus being just an educational advocate. So I did mention I'll talk a little bit because I know the interest here is on a national scale. I kind of wanted to summarize my idea of the differences between what institutional academic advocacy is versus on national academic advocacy. And, based on these ideas, for the scale of the advocacy, usually for institutional, it's much smaller scale because you're trying to influence just a core group of decision makers at a school with like a limited number of people, versus on a national, it has to be a much larger scale and larger efforts. However, the support for an institutional advocacy is typically limited because, you're only confined with the people that are really there. And that's the people that kind of, present that problem and kind of care enough to advocate for it. While on a national scale, advocacy efforts can be a lot more abundant because you can gather a lot more support. But then on the other hand, for implementation on an institutional level might be easier because it is central. So you really just have to convince limited number of people and they can kind of go through it because the decision-making happens from, the inside out. Versus on a national scale, this would be, the implementation is very decentralized, and you have to deal with the federal versus state, for example, or even an international scale between like countries. And then we go back to that concept of representation. Who are you typically advocating for? So on an institutional, it's usually you can be advocating for yourself because you're part of that institution, or just the close-knit local community. But on a national scale, you might be representing much larger organizations. And that kind of develops into or helps formulate the way that you want to advocate and what you need to do. Because if you're involving larger organizations, you would need to obviously take into account, the decision-making process, formulating statements and things like that. So those are just kind of the general broad overview on some of the differences that can shape the way that you approach an advocacy strategy if you're doing it for institution versus national scale. And, do you think there's any other factors to consider here? I know there's a good amount of experience on the national scale here and working with policymakers. So if you do have any other ideas, feel free to share or let us know in the chat, because this kind of helps you think about how you want to approach your advocacy strategy. So if you want to rely on the abundant support and the use of larger organizations, that will shape kind of what you're advocating for, basically. So, okay, well, and then, so after that, I just kind of wanted to talk briefly about the concept of a movement, right, and building a coalition. So this is a great kind of schematic of something called the Movement Action Plan, or MAP, which was a Moyer framework. And this is considered as one of the most effective strategic model for nonviolent social movements. But I do believe that it applies to all movements, like even smaller advocacy movements, and it doesn't have to be very large scale social movements. And it's always kind of good to keep that in the back of your mind, just to kind of see what the process would look like from start to finish. So just to kind of summarize, this here starts, with the business as usual, where the problems already exist. And in the plot here, you'll see the difference between how the reformers, which are basically the people that change the policies, the rebels, which might be people that do extreme measures in order to kind of raise awareness, then the public perception and the organizers. And so once problem exists, you have kind of this level of activity from everyone, but then you want to prove the institution's failure. And so this is because what people are more likely driven to be involved if you show them that these problems exist and the way that things are going is not sustainable, and this cannot be carried on as is. And in that case, you start seeing the public opinion kind of increase here once you have shown that, hypocrisy and how things are going. And then the next step is, or the next phase is when the condition starts to ripen. So this is typically a stage where, the organizers start to kind of get more involved. You start to get more public perception of the the situation and the gaps that are missing. And then you'll have typically trigger events that happen, which kind of really shoot everything into the public eye. And so these trigger events kind of cause this movement to take off. And then you'll have like a large amount of rebels that will kind of take part and start pushing that movement along and raising the public awareness on it. And then after that, there is typically, this is a very important phase, which is called the failure or the perception of failure. And this can be basically when the movement perceives that these power holders are too strong and that this movement has failed. But what's actually surprising is that this phase is a very good indicator that the movement is succeeding and that it is actually being taken seriously. And here, this is where the majority of the public opinion starts to shift even more, although you start to get a decline of the rebels, but you do get more organizers involved, and you start to the reformers start to take note of the movement as a whole and the demands that are being made. And then this stage can usually happen in the same time as stage number 6, which is that the majority of the public opinion changes. And this is when you kind of win over the neutral people and support even an increasingly larger majority of the people and involve them into the process. And then after that, hopefully, you succeed. And that can also, success can take different forms. So it can either be a dramatic showdown or a quiet showdown or just slowly fade out. And then in success 8 is the continuation, where you have to realize that this is not the end of the struggle, but it's kind of a continuation of it and to create new beginnings. And then this is just kind of good to kind of think about in the whole terms, but what we're going to really focus on is probably the first few phases of kind of taking a movement through until you kind of get that public opinion and majority on board. So what's the first step was, identifying and proving the failures of institutions. So how do you identify a problem and what you are actually asking for? So this typically starts with gathering a lot of background information, because these coalitions that you want to build can use that information to exercise their power. And so you want to really use the tools you have, such as libraries, internet, or learning, and you want to accumulate as many facts, data, stories, examples, background information from annual reports, archives. Like, you really have to dig to find all the background information, what has happened, previous attempts as well. And then once you have that, you want to fill those gaps. So you want to fill that by doing interviews, and you want to make sure you want to focus always on both the leaders and the people that are on the higher level, as well as the residents and the native populace that is really experiencing these problems, because they'll give you a much different perspective as well. And then you want to try to guide a discussion and bring people together in order to kind of figure out what is the main ask and what kind of the gap that exists is. So for the first case study of how we did that is, I'm going to talk about this OMBUDS office that we've been trying to establish here at the school. And what an OMBUDS office is a confidential, independent, informal, and neutral place for directing people for appropriate information, campus resources, or to express concerns and resolve disputes. So this is kind of similar to that educational advocate that I was talking about. And this place is usually an office. A lot of school has it, where people can just go confidentially talk to them and learn about, what do I do if I'm experiencing a problem? So what we did here is, at first we identified that there was a need and interest. So this was through like a return to work survey that I had conducted after COVID. And part of it was, what problems are you having? Would you be interested in having an OMBUDS office at the school? And there was a large support for it from the people that kind of responded. And then we kind of dug into what was the previous position, and we found out that it was actually limited, for example, to like School of Medicine, but it wasn't also like publicized, so it wasn't really being utilized a lot. And then it kind of faded out, and after COVID happened, it just kind of, the office was no longer there. And then again, we dug more into other media reports and archival records, and we found that there was previous calls for an OMBUDS office by faculty senates and other people at school. And there was actually a recommendation for establishing an OMBUDS office that was not taken up. And this was like many, many years ago. So we realized that there was other people kind of working on this, on these efforts. And so we started speaking with these other advocacy groups. And this was actually very critical in kind of connecting us with other ombuds at other schools that are established, and then kind of speaking with them, doing these interviews, which led us to talk with people from the International OMBUDS Association as well. And then these interviews that we did and we spoke with and collected more survey information taught us about the differences in the definitions. So for example, there was organizational ombuds versus institutional ombuds, and what each one serves and how each one functions. And then next week, actually, we have now a panel discussion with incorporating people from the International OMBUDS Association, other OMBUDS offices, and bringing people at the school so that they can learn more, and kind of raising awareness about the benefit of the OMBUDS office and how it might be useful for campus. And so with using all of that information, we were able to distill the ask, which we're still getting to here, is that we wanted a campus-wide OMBUDS office that meets the standard of practice and code of ethics as set by the IOA. So what this allowed us here to do is, first off, to highlight that we wanted a campus-wide office, because we knew that the last one was limited and that didn't really work out. So we wanted something that is better. And then instead of having to argue basically for the whole definition and having to, negotiate confidential, independent, informal, and neutral, we just say now the standards of practice set by the IOA, and that automatically kind of encompasses everything that we would need out of an office. So that's just kind of the case example of this on an institutional level, and how through that process of gathering information, collecting stories, archival records, you're able to really formulate your ask. And it is a learning process that you have to kind of get comfortable with until you know all the differences, because a lot of people can debate semantics with you and say, well, this happened, this, and if you didn't know that. So this is kind of just a case study of that. Let me just see the chat here. Yeah, exactly. So this is just the case study for the first step, which is just the collecting the data and identifying that gap that you need and how you can formulate the ask. So the next part that we wanted to talk about is the advocacy strategy. And that is, a method to influence a change or policy, which is a plan of action to have a desired outcome. And the strategy here, I like to think of it as an acronym of ripening the conditions, which is kind of also part of that movement building school, or the map that we've spoken about. And what that stands for is, recognizing allies, identifying your opportunities, and specifically opportunities for coalition building, and then presenting data-backed solution. And then you want to encourage the involvement and raising awareness among the people that you're thinking with, and the strategic relationship building. And then the N is for never give up, because even if you think things are failing and you're going through, it's too much to overcome, you have to keep pushing on, because that's a huge part of just being in advocacy in general. So any questions at all here, or before we'll go on to the other two examples? So I'll present like an institutional advocacy strategy and then a national advocacy strategy as well that I've been involved with. Okay, and if no questions, so the first part is, the recognizing your allies out of the ripen here. So we'll try to go through a couple of them before doing the case study. So when you want to recognize the spectrum of allies, this is a great graphic that I got from RISE, which is a wonderful school movement building organization. And here, this really kind of shows you this as a tool to examine the range of these social forces that can tell you how you need to plan and what you need to consider in order to get your allyship. And most movements don't actually win just by overpowering your opposition, but you actually want to shift these groups 1 degree over and try to get as many allies as possible. And so, this can really shape your strategy of advocacy that you're trying to implement. And this can tell you what tactics you need to plan and considerations you need to take. So is it really more, you want to have more active allies from the passive, or remove the passive opponents and make them neutrals, or shifting the neutral? And this is really a tool to bring more people into the movement so that you can have this sustained participation and encouraging that involvement with people across that whole spectrum. And then for the second step, which is for identifying opportunities, I like to use this graph, which is kind of a nested circle of what the different levels and tiers of levels in a government and on a national scale. And here you can see that, if you start off with citizens, business leaders, you go down to the bureaucrats, city council, mayor. As you go in, the influence here goes up, more of the decision makers, but also the number of individuals go down. And I'm not sure what level each person is, but most people at the advocacy group would be kind of community leaders or local bureaucrats. And what's important to understand here is that you have to identify that spectrum of allies that I showed exists on every ring of this circle. So you have passive and active opponents and allies from every different level. And it's important to recognize where you can actually build that coalition with the people from every level, so that you can shift more of the neutrals, the passive opponents, into the ally category. And then this is kind of on the national scale, but then on an institutional scale, I think there's a very similar trend where, like in academia, you can think of it as, the outer is with the highest number of individual, but probably the lowest influence is the students and trainees, and then faculty, department heads, and then you'll have the deans, like board of trustees or the president, and then basically the final decision makers here. And so this was also important for us to realize that when we're working together on an advocacy strategy for something, it doesn't always have to be on the outer ring. So we try to involve faculty with us. We try to have regular meetings with the department heads or the dean's offices and anyone that can have influence. And then they can each influence their own kind of circle and their own group of people. And that's kind of how you get into the middle. And then you can have the people with the largest influence basically incorporate that policy changes that you want. And so just to show you another case study here of how we implemented some of the strategies. So the second one, I'm going to talk about the postdoctoral financial burden. So at the school here, we wanted to basically, the goal of our advocacy committee was to reduce the burden for postdocs at the institution. And this started off by this issue being raised at a monthly forum. So again, this is how you identify the problem. And we identified that there was like three examples here of the different financial burdens, which can be from childcare or having a different renewal rate being set. So each year when you're getting renewed, you're bound to like an old contract that would have a different minimum stipend or salary. And then also there was a small difference between, for example, being a postdoc associate versus a postdoc fellow, and the fellow had to pay extra taxes on their healthcare. And, all of these are little things that are build up stressors and burden people when they're trying to, create families, pay rent, all that kind of stuff. So once this issue was raised, we wanted to collect that data with clear numbers. So this is kind of the presenting data-backed solutions and kind of figuring out what was the actual cost of these financial burdens for these postdocs. So how much were people paying for like childcare? How much were they losing out on this renewal rate because they were sticking around for like several years? How much was this tax burden on fellows? And then we had to formulate the ask, right? So we had to formulate it and figure out how do we ask for this, or how do we figure out what the problem is? And we identify this as not just financial burden and a stressor for people, but that this is a loss of talent because people might end up leaving the school, and a disincentive for taking fellowships, for example. And fellowships are really prestigious for a school, so they want as many people to take and get fellowships. But if there's no incentive or there's a disincentive for it, then that kind of hurt the school. And then the next step was to identify these allies in the main offices. So we actually set up periodic meetings with our university leadership and the postdoctoral affair office. And we had regular meetings, which enables us to collaborate with them and, either through surveys, through monthly meetings where we bring up these issues, where we bring that data that we collect back to them. And then we can bring them with a solution as raises or subsidies. And this is just an example of an announcement for a childcare subsidy that last year that actually did not initially include like postdoc, associate, and fellows, but then once we brought it up and we mentioned childcare, now both of those are included. Another example is this announcement from last summer, which actually showed that the compensation will be increased to the minimum of each year through the automatic renewal, so that people didn't have to basically like a fourth year postdoc making as much as a first year, and you're automatically getting whatever raises come. And then even more recently, we also had this announcement for the healthcare subsidy for fellows, where now your basically health stipend that you get is also supplemented with the additional cost of the taxes that you pay on it at the end of the year. And there is rumors now of also a pay increase coming in. So this is kind of what all of that would look like. And I know emails are not very exciting, but it's that's kind of the outcome. And this is when a policy is changed, and after a long time working on it. And so then I did want to kind of also present how these policy and advocacy strategies can differ from, as we mentioned, institutional versus a national scale. And so one of the national postdoc associations that I work with, or the advocacy committee at the NPA that I work with, their goal is to improve the benefit and to standardize this postdoc experience. And so the way that we had been doing something about this recently is that we were collecting institutional information. So the NPA had releases a survey that I think was triannual, that they might be doing annually. And they collect information about benefits, population, programs offered, all that kind of stuff. But since this is on a national scale, it's a little more difficult to just kind of take it back to somebody. But anyways, we collect all of this information, and then I worked with them through analyzing this result. So we anonymously started kind of scoring what matters, what is kind of aligned with the NPA's mission, and how can we standardize and improve that postdoc experience. And then once we found out the schools that, let's say, have the highest scores out of all of this, we plan on kind of interviewing and seeing what are their best practices of implementing these changes. And then this is where we can present these methodologies back so that different schools of different sizes can implement these similar changes. And this is where that encouraging that involvement part of the strategy kind of comes into play. So I think for a national scale, it's really tougher to ask for something, but you can kind of put the good information out there and then just encourage people to kind of do as well as their peers, basically. So that's kind of the strategy for a national scale. Just want to see if anyone has any questions. Okay. So I guess now that you've identified, what the problem is, and you've identified what strategy you need to do, you've identified your allies, you're going to have to practice your pitch, right? In order to kind of go up to somebody and present them with the problem and encourage them to be involved. So this is a typical, plot of what's known as an elevator pitch, which, in business involves many, many steps and, business plans and all that kind of stuff. And you have to get the numbers and cost. But really, I think for advocacy, it's a little simpler and kind of can be distilled in a few concepts. And, the first one is to find the incentive. So several problems can have the same solutions, and you need to figure out that the reason somebody might want to help you can be different, even if you're asking for the same solution. So you want to be able to find that niche of why are people interested? So in the case study of the burden, for the financial burden, we know that for postdocs, the problem is, I just want to be able to live and spend, right? But for the school, it's a disincentive of taking a fellowships. For other people, it might be affecting their career development. So you really have to make sure you find that incentive for depending on who you're talking to. So if you remember those rings of the different groups, depending on which level and who you are approaching and giving that pitch to, you want to make sure you ask them based on what they think is a big problem in that issue, and how that same solution that can apply to multiple people can be helpful. The next thing is to prioritize your ask. So it's a lot better if you can create actionable items and give people something to work on. Even if people want to help you, if you're just presenting them, hey, here's all these problems, here's whatever, like some broad solution, they won't know where to start, or they might have too much going on their plate that they don't really follow up on it. And so if you give them and tell them, hey, I need you to reach out or put me in touch with this person, or I need you to bring this resolution up to this person, or like this next higher level person. It really helps in actually making sure that someone has a specific task to do, and it's a lot easier for them to be able to help you with it. So you want to make sure that you find that problem and then specifically give them a task for you to help you with your ask. And then at the end, you want to make sure that, you offer the help to stay engaged. And this not only shows the sincerity of both sides, but this does give you that opportunity to remain engaged in the planning and execution, which allows you to also follow up with people. Because a lot of times things take a long time. People need to talk to other people. And this is, again, something to consider when you're planning. For example, I was saying when you're part of a larger organization or you're dealing with yourself, people have to report to others and you'll have to wait on them. And if, they say, okay, I'll do it, and you're not offering any help, then it's kind of even more difficult to kind of get it back started and having to like figure out what has happened. So really, I think with those three things in mind, developing a pitch will have to be kind of customized for the person that you're speaking for and for the problem that you're trying to face. And so with that, I think it would be time for our first breakout room. And I guess we can break it into two groups of two, maybe talking together. I don't know. What do you think, Hera?
Yes. Yeah, that sounds good. Let me actually just.
So let me just talk about it while you set up the room real quick. So the pitch here, we kind of gave you an idea of what you want to work on. And this is for a development office, career development office for non-academic careers specifically. So it's usually the career offices at schools will have, telling you how to get into PhDs or after PhD doing postdocs, but you want to try to formulate a pitch for, career development office for non-academic careers, and try to, come back and just give like a quick 30-second pitch, like an elevator pitch on how that is beneficial, as like identify what is the niche, prioritize what your ask is, and being able to summarize it, and then just kind of offering help. So I don't know, should we give like 5 minutes or 7-8 minutes maybe?
Yes, so I think I'll give everyone, sorry.
Or should we just let each person, I guess, do their own pitch, or what do you think?
Yeah, so actually let's give everyone like 7 minutes. And
Okay.
then the breakout rooms will automatically close after that time.
Okay.
And basically what I'm looking at right now is that I have the first room has 2 of our participants in there, and then Azmi, you're going to be moved to a second room with someone else.
Okay.
I can't like unhost myself to make myself a participant in the breakout rooms, unfortunately. Okay. So I'll just hang out. But yeah, I'm going to open the breakout rooms right now.
Okay, I want to be mindful of the time, so I'm gonna keep going because we do have one last section on the negotiation aspect. So negotiations, are strategic discussions that can help resolve an issue in a way that both parties can reach a clear understanding and find acceptable. Now, the reason I underline both of those two, because this concept has to be really well understood for you as a scientist, that the role for policy assessment and scientific description can or have to be separate from your personal beliefs on how to implement it. So this kind of goes back to that very first concept we spoke about of the science versus normative science of what is, which is the clear understanding of the topic. And then what do you find acceptable? So what is your personal belief on the normative science of that is guiding that policy change or the best implementation? So when you're negotiating, you really have to make sure that at the beginning, when you're describing and you're doing a policy assessment to present it to someone, you're kind of separating that from and approaching it from like a policy neutral kind of place. But what happens obviously when you're in an impasse or when both parties do not find the suggestion acceptable? So there is this thing called BATNA, or Best Alternative to Negotiated Agreement. I got this from this program of negotiation from the Harvard Law School, which you can find a bunch of free reports here that I would encourage reading that talk about negotiating salaries, etc., stuff like that. And this can kind of like some of the main steps of it is that you have to do a thorough comparison of what are all of your alternatives. So if you're asking for something and you're not going to get it, what is the next best thing that you can do? And this can kind of decide the course of action to pursue if you're not reaching anywhere. And so this evaluating that deal is really important to examine your BATNA and the person that you're negotiating with so that you know when to walk away. So when is a good enough deal is going to happen if you do get your alternative, and when is it not good for you and this would actually might be hurtful for what you're trying to advocate for. And then the other concept that I found really interesting is what's called a 2-level BATNA. So you're basically when you're negotiating with someone, and Mark actually brought that up for second in the room is that there's a negotiator versus their organization. So even if they really want to help you and they're really interested in that advocacy, you have to understand that they are negotiating on behalf of something bigger. And on the other hand, even if they're not interested in what they want to help you, you want to negotiate it from a term of, hey, if you don't reach an agreement on this, your higher ups or your organization might fail. And that, is something that might interest them. So that kind of different levels is really important to kind of like keep in mind when you are doing a negotiation tactic. All right, I did have a quick question here. Just something to think about because I don't want to go over, but how does this process differ on institutional versus the national advocacy, and how does it differ when you're advocating for yourself versus on an organization level, right? So when you're doing institutional, it's easier to kind of negotiate with maybe one person, or if you're negotiating with, let's say, your supervisor, versus on a national advocacy, it's a lot more difficult to go as a small committee and trying to negotiate with like NIH or something, because that's not how that line of negotiation works. But some things to kind of think about when you're kind of formulating that pitch and what your best alternatives are. And then when you're obviously doing negotiations on behalf of one organization, you can rarely make that decision on the fly and be the one that's making those. So you have to kind of take that into account and kind of go back and see what the approval process would be like. So we do have another breakout room, but I feel like we could maybe just talk about it with people here, Naira. What do you think? So just kind of using that same pitch of the career development for non-academic, we're thinking like, how do you provide that ask, and what do you think are some best alternatives? So if you are negotiating for that with your school institution, does anybody want to just kind of jump in instead of having to do breakout rooms?
I know Jessica had a specific question. Do you prefer to talk about it in like with the group or? Oh, okay. Okay. Sure, absolutely. So I think that like my thoughts would be like if our pitch is, better incentivization for people to enter PhD programs in terms of like the non-academic career office, alternatives necessarily, if they say like, okay, it's too much money to have a career office right now, etc. The first alternative I would think about is to have a faculty and student-led group that would host workshops and networking events more informally, that won't require a lot of funding and is purely virtual. So it would be more of like a career development club, let's say like a student organization that gets funding, as opposed to an entire office where they have to hire formal staff, etc. And that's kind of like one alternative. And, I would say my terms in this negotiation would be like, students are not allowed to be looked down upon or blocked in any way by their PIs from attending these networking events if there's like a culture of academia only, etc. But yeah, that's like the first thing that came to mind. Does anyone else want to?
In like a similar suit, maybe having an actual course like a neuroscience as a profession or whatever, your subject topic is, where they could bring in guest lecturers and even do it on like a voluntary basis where they're not having to pay the lecturers to come in. Something that again could promote that idea without actually raising costs and would be widespread to all of the students without that fear of, are their PIs going to say something? Is there going to be contention with finding out that your trainee is at these events and talking about wanting to do something else, and maybe they led you to believe something else? That could be a way to get everyone involved without that discrepancy coming into play.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and those are all really great ideas. I mean, creating workshops, clubs, committees, doing virtual tours, or establishing agreements with non-academic like companies to come in and give talks, for example, doing a full-fledged class that people can kind of participate in. So those are all great alternatives. And I like the point that Naira also made of maybe like specifying the details of it, that, like it's like not just being like mandatory or free of cost or like making sure that those specific details, and that might be where like that walk away point can be kind of decided on those stuff. So okay, so I know we're at time, but I guess the final slide, so it's just some final considerations here and some of the rephrasing and take home messages is, I think for part of your advocacy, one of the most important things is to have the empathy so that you can recognize the problem and so that you can relate to the native people that are experiencing it. It's really tough to advocate for something and hit roadblocks if you're not personally like invested or you have that empathy towards the people that are going through that problems that you're advocating for. And then the next thing is you really need to ideate on the current system. As we said, like fill those gaps, find the problem, find the niche ask, and you need to be comfortable talking about it, right? But then you also have to remember that as scientists and advocates, you would have to provide good science and possible solutions so that you would have that credibility of why these problems can be solved in the way that you're suggesting for them to be solved. And then the last one is really, the more you familiarize yourself with the pitch and what you're working on, what the problem is, the easier it is for you to just like, quickly talk to somebody about it, have other talking points that are ready based on how someone responds to you about it. And then the last thing is obviously be engaged, never give up, join other movements. This is how I ended up here. I joined one movement, which joins a committee, which puts me in contact with somebody else. And that network building is great. And these are just some of the, different positions here. So these are some of the national scale, organizations like Science Coalition, UCS, NSPN, and AAAS. But also there's advocacy in scientific society. So whatever society, chemical society, physical, molecular, they have their own advocacy committees, and those are also great for networking. And with that, sorry, I went a little over, but if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to stick around and talk as well. I guess I can just stop my screen share for now.